There are over 44,000 species on Earth threatened with extinction, and many more have not even been discovered yet. However, only a small handful of these endangered species actually get conservation attention and funding. This, of course, includes the big charismatic mammals like pandas, tigers, and elephants. But what about the rest of the 44,000 species threatened with extinction? Can we save them all? Today, I invite Scott Trageser, Executive Director of the Biodiversity Group, as well as co-founder of the Creative Conservation Alliance, to discuss this imbalance and what we can do to save these species that are not getting enough funding or conservation attention. We also discuss how saving a species even works, because we may hear that, oh, this NGO is saving this rhino species, or this NGO is saving orangutans, but how exactly does this work? What does saving a species actually entail? There are so many gold nuggets in this conversation, so let's jump right in.
Welcome to the Ecochat podcast. In each episode, we chat with experts in conservation, animal welfare, sustainability, or environmental science to learn how you and I can make a difference for the planet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Hey Scott, how's it going?
Hey, it's going great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for coming on. So let's start with, what do you do and what's your mission?
Save wildlife, like all of us, right? But in general, like the really overarching view, it's to protect life overlooked. It's these species and habitats that other organizations tend to neglect. They overall don't receive adequate conservation attention. And that's kind of a ambiguous term. We can get into that later, but there's not a lot of data, comprehensive data for us to understand who's doing what, and so what qualifies as life overlooked. But in general, we think about it as like reptiles, amphibians, mushrooms, and fish, stuff like that.
All right, so it's to save species that have not received enough conservation attention. So why do you think that is? Why are there species that don't receive enough conservation attention?
Well, the obvious reasons why, when you try to ask somebody, let's protect the snake species, they tend to not contribute much financially. So it's these things that, I mean, generally we're asking in the conservation field for somebody to care about something, a species other than their own, and somewhere in a place other than their home. And those are two giant obstacles for us as conservationists to overcome. So if you're working locally in, like, if I was working in the United States and trying to protect something, say within Arizona where we're based, life would be a lot easier because people can see it's in their own backyard. It's kind of like yes, in my backyard kind of situation. But when I'm asking somebody to protect something that is about as different from their mammalian lineage as possible and in a place very different from their own, they struggle to understand why that's important. Maybe they'll understand, but they don't feel why it's important. So then it's always a struggle to be able to get buy-in from people to be able to care about these things that truly do need conservation attention. Like the tropics are the most diverse, obviously, and so it's the things there need a lot of help. But to try and convince people to do that is quite a challenge. So that's kind of where we're fitting in, and where our partners are fitting in, where we're trying to plug all these holes in the conservation field where, rhinos get adequate conservation attention relative to other species. I don't think we're going to be, losing southern white rhino. So it's like something like that, but we are going to lose several other species of mammal. And then so the idea is to be able to really effectively figure out where to put our effort and how to do so. And that's kind of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned rhinos. And I think, rhinos belong to this group of popular charismatic mammals that get most of our attention. So for example, anything that's big, cute, or colorful. So pandas, tigers, elephants, they get most of our attention. But then you have all these other species, like you mentioned, like reptiles, amphibians, fish, that are just neglected. So can you explain to the audience, why do we even need to consider these other species? And what's the importance of conserving these other species as well?
I mean, it's the importance of saving anything, right? That's multifactorial. So it depends, when I talk about this, it would depend on the audience. Sometimes, you can have the like ecosystem services arguments where, okay, well, if we lose bees and pollinators, then it costs X amount for the economy, or if we lose like freshwater filtering services and that kind of thing. So you can always push those out, and they're very valid. They're great reasons. Ultimately, personally, I don't think that's the correct reason to justify why we're going to save something. It truly is just to save it because it deserves to live. I mean, it's sad that I even have to say that, but it's like, this living piece of art took millions of years to evolve, and it's likely conscious, and it has a life, it has goals, and it's not morally acceptable for us to extinguish that lineage. That's not our decision to make. If it happens naturally, sure, but we're not acting naturally anymore. So it's, these things certainly they should be perfectly worthless. Their lives shouldn't be like the worth of their lives shouldn't be based on how much they contribute to our economies necessarily. It should simply be that they exist, and just like we do, and we have a right to exist, and so do they. But you can have all kinds of nuanced arguments about this, and I'm very willing to have those. But in general, that's kind of the scheme.
No, that makes sense. And when you say these species aren't getting, quote unquote, the attention that they deserve, is it possible to tease apart what exactly is the cause of that? Is it like, for example, a lack of funding, or a legal shortcoming, or a general lack of knowledge or awareness about these species, or something else?
Yeah, excellent question. Because generally we know how to save things. It's not that more research is necessarily needed to save life on Earth. We just need buy-in from governments and communities and various people to be able to act. And so we have things like the IUCN, which demarcates if something is, critically endangered, vulnerable, not near threatened, that kind of thing. And so we can say if something requires attention. Most things, actually not most things, there's quite a few that are not assessed yet. But many things we do know whether they need attention, but whether or not they're getting that attention is another question. So the conservation community is all struggling, and we're not as cohesive as we could be. So we don't have any database. Even the closest database we have to knowing all the conservation organizations and who's doing what is connectandconserve.org, which is something that the Biodiversity Group has created. And so with this, we are aggregating all this information from the most cohesive data set of all the organizations on Earth and what they're doing and how they're doing it. So then we can say, okay, if there's one critically endangered species and it has 50 organizations working on it and gets, $5 million a year, and then there's another critically endangered species who gets zero attention, there's no funding towards it. That one of those critically endangered species is likely to go extinct. The other one likely isn't. And so that's what we're trying to identify, so that we know what's going to fall through the cracks, and just to be able to recognize that and tell the community, hey, by the way, we're not giving any attention to this. And so if you're an up and coming conservationist, you're trying to start a new project, or if you're an established organization looking to increase your impact, that's a great way to do it. Because if you want to jump in on the train for saving rhinos, like, there's a lot of money, but now there's so many organizations working with rhinos that they pop up, and they're actually, just trying to scam. It's getting, when anything gets too much money, there's somebody who's going to try to skim off the top, right? And most organizations are not doing that, right? But there are little ones, and when I talk to my friends working on rhinos, where it's like, no, don't give money to that group because they actually don't know what they're doing, kind of thing. But then so it's troublesome to jump on and make any real impact where everybody else is working. But if there's nobody working on another species, you can have immense impact for way less effort. So it's all about being effective with our time and resources. And that's because we are incredibly bootstrapped. Like, we do not have enough money at current and manpower to be able to save everything that we want to save. And so we do have to make some decisions, and to make those decisions, we need adequate data, and that's what we're trying to collect.
Very interesting. So a follow-up question to that, it seems like there are a few problems here. One is that you're saying there's too many endangered species, and we can't save them all, so we need to prioritize. So is the underlying bottleneck here that there just isn't enough funding to save all these animals? Is like lack of funding or resources the main limitation here?
Yeah, the easiest way to put this in perspective is, so the U.S. philanthropically contributes over $450 billion a year, and that increases every year, which is fantastic, right? We're the highest contributors worldwide of any country. But then when you break that down, humans and our pets receive somewhere up between 97 and 98% of all those contributions. And so like essentially for one species and those species that immediately like we require, like cows and things, though that one species gets 97 to 98% of all donations, and then the other million plus species on Earth get to suck off this last 2%. And it's just not reasonable in any way that you conceive of it. So there needs to be a better balance there. And where that mark is, if it's 10% or 20, that's a really difficult question to ask. It's a very interesting one, but it's not just for me to decide either. So again, we're just trying to collect this data and let people know that there is this massive imbalance. It doesn't have to be like this. And if we see it, people come up a lot of times, like in the depths of social media comments and things, which are somewhat they don't highlight my day sometimes. They'll come at us and say, why aren't you working with humans? Like, we humans have problems. Like, well, yes, we absolutely do, and we definitely need to be working on humans. But did you know that we get almost all the help, and the other million species get almost no help? And so when you really put it into perspective, that really shuts them down immediately. Like, oh, well, I guess, I don't really have any ground to stand on. Nobody's going to argue that you want 100% of all donations going to just humans. That makes no sense, and it's not sustainable. And even if they did argue that, it's not a wise decision, because you lose your pollinators, you lose your if you lose all the phytoplankton in the sea, you don't have any oxygen to breathe anymore. So like, you kind of need the ecosystem to persist. So it makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, for sure. So you're gathering this database of all the species in need, and then you're looking at how many organizations are contributing to saving these species and how much funding is allocated to each species. And then you're kind of looking at the areas of balance and imbalance, right? So first of all, what's this project called? Is there a name for it? And then are there any noticeable or interesting trends that you would like to share?
Right. It's called Connect and Conserve. connectandconserve.org, and it's in its alpha stage right now. The website's up. You can see some of the preliminary data, and it's fun to look around on this. Really, there hasn't been anything exceptionally surprising to me about what we're doing. It's mostly we're trying to figure out where the money's going from the U.S. to where. Are we giving too much? And because it's a lot of this is in development. That's why I say, like, we can't be that surprised about anything. But we're developing like a conservation equitability index. So you can take various features of every area and say, okay, well, the U.S. has this $10 billion that we donate overseas, and we're going to give a lot of it to, some percentage to Brazil, some percentage to Niger, some percentage to Thailand. And then you can say, okay, well, is that really the way that we should be allocating these resources? And you can say, okay, well, based on the size of the country, based on the number of endemics, based on the number of edge species, based on, the number of critically endangered and everything else, you can place all these values and all these features, and then and you have the amount, and then you can kind of make this comprehensive view of, well, we're actually giving too much money to Brazil, say, totally hypothetically, and we should be giving more money to, Niger or Sudan or something.
Sorry, when you say give out money to these developing countries like Thailand, Brazil, etc., what exactly do you mean by give out money?
Yeah, right. So it's giving money to, this is all nonprofit. So this is money from donations from individuals and corporations to profits in the United States, and then that gets redistributed to nonprofits in other countries. So it'd be to nonprofits in Thailand in order to save tigers or elephants or whatever it is. And there you can easily see how, certain countries, based on proximity to the United States, based on a familiarity, would have more, we would be biased towards giving more money than we effectively should to those countries. So again, these aren't necessarily our decisions to make. I'm just putting out information out there so that we can send it to people like the Conservation Finance Alliance, who manages like $300+ million a year when they distribute, and they can have that information at hand and be like, oh, actually, we see that we're spending too much money in Colombia and we should be spending it more in Ecuador or something like that. Again, totally hypothetical, but that's something we're trying to look at.
Got it. And to go down this rabbit hole even further, is this funding, are we just looking at like NGOs giving money to other NGOs in other countries? Or are we also talking about like government lending? So for example, we have the International Monetary Fund where countries or governments would lend money to these other countries. And there's a lot of terms and conditions that apply.
Yeah, important distinction, because it's just the philanthropic nonprofits, and the government to government aids, that data is hard for us to access, and it's also really vague. The way they break down, the OECD is like a group of nations, developed nations that, and they kind of give the best breakdown of how they spend this money. But a lot of governments and even nonprofits, they don't really, especially internationally, they don't do great record keeping, or at least they don't put it out there for everybody to look at, because there's things they don't want people to see, and so they just don't want too much scrutiny. So then it's hard to really dig into that and get the facts. And so we're looking strictly at nonprofit funds, which we can then scrape public and private and government repositories that are accessible to us. Sometimes we have to pay access, and then we can kind of make educated guesses within air range of what they're doing with that money. So sometimes it's just you donate to WWF, and then it distributes to WWF partner, like WWF South Africa or something like that, and then we can track that money. But even then, within that, we have a lot of difficulty very precisely figuring out what they're doing with that, because they don't tell you what they're spending it on. If it's like, you can't just ask how much money did you spend on lions in South Africa, WWF. Like I maybe they know because they have really good corporate accounting, but most organizations wouldn't be able to tell you that readily. So we come up with some ways that we can do this in kind of, I want to say creative ways of assessing this information that we can more or less gauge its accuracy. So that's, again, really, it's kind of complicated, and it's all coming out, but it's all just nonprofit trying to figure out what we're doing.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying that. So I want to take a step back and really understand, how exactly do we save a species? So let's say there's a critically endangered frog somewhere in Ecuador. How exactly do we go about conserving that species?
Okay, so the first step is, and one that the biodiversity group takes often, is that we have to know that it's there. We have to name it also. So you go into these ranges, especially in the Andes. It's the most biodiverse region on Earth, and you go up there, and it's really incredible. Like, these expeditions are super fun for when you know what you're looking for, or even if you don't, you just get along for the ride and some crazy stuff. But so we go there, and we can discover something new because we know what already exists, and then we can describe it with local partners, and we can put that up in through just the academia route. And then once we know it's there, then the next step is to get it assessed by IUCN, which we can also do the assessments and say, okay, well, it's only within its occupancy area is this, and we perceive threats of this, and so they have a structure that says, okay, now we know it's critically endangered. So now we know that there's something there. It has a name. It's critically endangered. The next step is you have to ask for funds. Now that you can actually ask somebody, you can't ask somebody I want to protect this thing, but we don't really know what it is. That's harder than saying, well, we know where it is. So once you do that, the biodiversity group, also we go up to these reserves, and these land managers generally have a big area, and researchers come and they do great science, but sometimes they don't take the greatest, they're not best at PR and don't have the best media. So we take great photos and video and do the great science. And all together, we give that to the local land manager that is generally a nonprofit. And then with that, they can go and petition. They have all these resources, and I can get into more resources that we actually contribute to them too. Then they can go and petition to one of the big granting organizations, and they say, okay, well, we have all these critically endangered animals, X, Y, and Z, and we're in this area, and make this argument now, a very solid argument that we need money to protect this area based on X, Y, and Z. if that is legitimate and the granting organization accepts that, then they can provide funding to then, increase ranger patrols, buy up adjacent areas and that kind of thing. So with the big one that we've been working on lately was the Rio Manduriacu Reserve in Ecuador. It's on the Pacific version of the Andes. Really incredible area. It's managed by Fundación Ecominga and Fundación Condor Andino. And those are all great organizations to support as well. But so we do a lot to try to make sure that they have what they need to protect what needs to be protected. And with that, they were able to double, partially with our help, right? It's not just all of us, but big collective, we were able to double the size of the reserve based on all the discoveries and the promotional media that we created. And then once you can protect something like that, but then a big thing that's been happening in Ecuador, I'm sure some of your audience has heard, I'm not sure if you have, but there's been a big push for rights of nature. And since 2021, it's been in the constitution since like 2008, I think. And so the Ecuadorian constitution says, if you are going to cause an extinction in that country, it is unconstitutional because the nature has the rights to exist, which I fully endorse. And so there's a couple countries, including Panama, that also have these laws on books, which is fantastic. It's a trend that's moving in a great direction. And that's been a saving grace because there's been the Ecuadorian state is hard up for cash. They didn't do well in the pandemic. And so they have a bunch of mineral wealth, and that then creates a bias in their decision making. So they end up selling these concessions, these big areas of land that are on like private reserves already established on, like virgin forest. These are like, and every ridge of the Andes has endemics, like just minute amounts of change within the cloud forest, how much moisture reaches that area and when. It creates these pockets of endemicity. So you're actually...
Which, for the audience, this means that these species are unique and you can't find them anywhere else in the world. So they can only be found in one mountain, for example.
Exactly. And they've been there for, hundreds of thousands, millions of years and evolved, and they've become these gorgeous, amazing things that we barely know anything about. And then you're selling these concessions, but then you're going to create a massive disturbance within this very delicate ecosystem. You're going to... we've seen it all around the world, especially in third world countries or developing countries, that these big mining projects have spills. They have accidents, like they have them in the United States, not as much, right? It's likely better to be mining in the United States than in Ecuador, but just because the controls are better. So, so the big one that happened was the Los Cedros Reserve had a big concession from CHP Billiton, which is an Australian conglomerate. And there's a lot of interesting things we can go into with this, but essentially the mining conglomerate, they will they'll go through a local subsidiary or company that takes all the risk. It's like this little startup mining company, and they do all the permits and they take all the risks. So CHP Billiton can have separation from it. And then that they buy the concession. They had then been illegally surveying, going in without permission. They did that in Manduriacu, and then they did it with Cedros. And then they are able to figure out that, okay, there's gold and copper here. We're going to make a mine. And then we have to fight against it and say, okay, well, there's all these species here. And because we did the surveys and took the pretty photos and everything, we can show the courts, when this goes to court, because this Los Cedros one was challenged in 2021. It went up to the Supreme Court. And at that point, we were really worried because usually these court cases don't play out well for nature. But in this case, we got super lucky, and the court was in our favor. The judges ruled that the mining concession that would have destroyed the Los Cedros Reserve and the Manduriacu Reserve, because it was just downstream, that whole watershed would have been totally messed up. And so they deemed it unconstitutional, that it was going to infringe upon the rights of nature. And that was this massive win that set all this precedent within the country. We've had two other mining concessions also be removed thereafter, and then come in the next couple years. And now there's this thing where certain individuals are having their lives threatened by other certain individuals that are with the powers that are. I have to be careful what I say here, but it's like the powers that be don't like the momentum that conservation is gaining in that country. And so obviously they're going to resort to something, shitty, and they're threatening the lives of our friends and colleagues down there. So they're not, as willing to testify in court, to be able to say like, okay, well, the mining companies, their environmental assessment was actually really shoddy, and we found all this other stuff that you didn't find, and it actually isn't. There's this Adelopus toad, and it's critically endangered, and then that's like the whole argument for everything. And if you can't have people testify to that, to that, then it's going to be a real big problem. So, we have a plan to go in, and I can't say too much about it, but we're going to be trying to fix this problem in a couple other expeditions. In some of, I have to be really vague about this, but in some amount of time, we're going to be taking this data so that we can then testify internet, like via Zoom, so we don't have to worry about people threatening our lives and that kind of thing. So it's alleviating pressure from the conservationists locally, and still fighting and to protect. To circle back to your initial question, like this is all in order to protect the frog that we then had discovered, and it's this whole thing. It's not simply go discover it and describe it and get some money. Like nothing's ever. You'll hear conservationists say this. Nothing's ever truly saved. Like it's you literally have a frog on a private reserve. You think you're fine, but then lo and behold, the government sells the land from up beneath you, and then you still have to fight for it. So it's like any number of things can happen, and you have to adapt to that situation, whatever it gives you.
All right, that was a very insightful and long answer. So let me just recap and let me know if I'm missing anything. So going back to our initial question, how do we even save or conserve a species? First of all, we need to go on expeditions. We need to find the thing. We need to know that it exists, and then we need to make sure it is a new species. And then we need to get it assessed by the IUCN, which basically determines whether it's endangered, critically endangered, etc. And then if it is endangered, if it does need conservation attention, then we need to ask for funding to protect that area, and then potentially fight in court if that area is owned by something like a mining company or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. You're going to you discover it, but there's going to be any number of forces that threaten that in the future, so that you have to adapt to it, and you have to have money to be able to protect it, whether it's increasing ranger patrols or fighting in court or simply protecting more land so that you don't get inbreeding, depression, something like that.
Okay, so going back to the first stage, which is you go into these expeditions to find a new species and you name it. So how do you know that it is a new species? What's the definition of a new species?
Well, I think there's 41 or 42 different species theories, species concepts out there. So it really depends on who you talk to, but in general, it's something that's morphologically and genetically distinct enough, and you can draw lines in the sand. Maybe it's 2% or something, a difference to make it different from one species to the other. Sometimes different species are cryptic, meaning that they look very similar, but they are genetically distinct. But that's all on a continuum too. Sometimes, so populations can differ, and if there's sufficient structure within that population, then you can have subspecies break out, and some people argue subspecies are a real thing, and then you have species. And these are kind of all abstract concepts, so that's a whole other thing you can go into. But it's generally what we always want to be able to define something and make it discrete, and in order to do that, you have to draw an arbitrary line in the sand, and that's what we kind of do. But so you take the genetics, you do a bunch of morphological measurements on it, and then you can compare that to all the other closely related genera or conspecifics, and then you can make an assessment of whether it's new or not.
Right. And the reason why I got in touch with you in the first place is I saw your post on social media about this 3D scanning tool that you used to describe a new species of frog, I think. So correct me if I'm wrong, but traditionally how we would define a new species is we basically need to kill it. We need to kill the poor thing, put it in a jar of oil, and then take its DNA, etc., and then we need to quote-unquote specimen it. Is that correct? And then how does this 3D scanning help solve the issue of having to kill the poor thing?
Yes, that's been true for all but maybe one or two species described. I think there was a primate that was described in Africa without actual specimen, because there was only one left. And I believe the other one's escaping me. But yeah, overall, you almost always collect what's called a type series, and that can be 3 or more males and 3 or more females, and then you capture the diversity. You hopefully capture the representative diversity of that species. when you say you collect it, that means you ethically euthanize it, and that depends on how to do that, depending on the taxon. And then from that, you deposit it into a museum, you preserve it in ethanol, and then it's available for theoretically anybody else to be able to look at and to confirm that your observations were valid, and that this measurement is true, and that somebody else could do some future work on it if they wanted to look at something else about the animal and do any further research. Those have been hugely valuable, and they're like, we're definitely not saying that that's something that we should stop. I mean, it is the only reasonable route that we've had to be able to do species research. But now, the technology is advancing, so we do have, in certain cases, we have an option to not actually euthanize these animals. So if you have a critically endangered animal, and you essentially know that because you're in a really small habitat, and you have a good idea that it's probably isolated, and you've been doing surveys for 2 weeks and you only found one, so you wouldn't want to euthanize that because it could be the last female on Earth, and then you just literally you just curse that whole species to extinction. So we haven't had any option to not euthanize it until this point, and now the Biodiversity Group, in partnership with Sony Electronics, have developed the first field portable 3D scanner for wildlife. So this is the first time ever that we were able to just pull this thing out in like a 25-liter backpack. One person can operate it. We can go out there and we can rediscover species or discover new species in the most remote jungle, and without any power or anything, we can bring out our own and scan this animal. We get a very accurate 3D representation of that animal, which we can then we do a bunch of post work with the laptop, and then we can upload that to an online database, which serves as the museum. And then everybody instantaneously across the world can gain access to that specimen, instead of it being siloed in a museum in Quito, and you probably have to know the curator to be able to get access to it, and you can't access it on weekends. It's kind of hard to access specimens sometimes. So this democratizes access immediately, which is fantastic. And they've shown, there was recent papers came out that said the more access you have to these animals, the more publications you get out of it. So a big limitation is simply being able to access them. And this 3D scans, even if they weren't supplanting the need or the euthanization in certain cases, you would still want to 3D scan a lot of animals, just because it democratizes access. And then the other aspect to this is we can actually gain additional data from these specimens that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. So in general, you take these 2D measurements of animals, like what's a finger length, or between the eyes and things like that. And now with the 3D representations, we can take these volumetric morphometrics. We can take these measurements of the volume of a head or the body, and then compare it quantitatively, automatically, between all the 3D scans that you created, and then compare that to all the 3D scans of another species. And then it not only saves you time, but you gain an additional metric to be able to distinguish one species from another. That's all really cool for scientists. Maybe it goes over the head of some people, but trust me, it's really neat. The other really incredible thing about these 3D scans that I think people really latch onto is that it's going to forever change how we engage the youth and public about wildlife. Because now with this 3D scan, you can have, we're in January, we're having a big presentation to dozens of classrooms at the same time, where we can have these 3D animals be you can put VR goggles on, you can shrink down to the size of the animal, you can blow the animal up to the size of a building, you can have it hop on to the hand of the kid and then speak to it like a human would. So you're anthropomorphizing the animal and kind of helping to bridge that gap between human and non-human. If it's speaking your language and it has mouth movements like yours, then you can relate to it more and care. So then it's having those as accessible options is huge for wildlife outreach and engagement, and for zoos, for nonprofits, for individuals, everybody.
Right. So when I first heard that to define a new species, you need to specimen it, which means you need to kill it, put it in a jar, and have it in a museum. That was really shocking to me, because I was thinking, this seems like a technology in the 1980s or something. We've had 3D scanning for a long time. We already have this technology for decades, where we can just take a sample of skin or a blood sample and get their DNA. So what's the rationale for still needing to kill a frog in order to define it as a new species? Couldn't we just use a more non-invasive way to do this?
So like it's hard because I don't think there really was a good rationale for euthanizing something that was like that critically endangered, right? It's just like it wasn't ethical to do so, and I think a lot of people did avoid doing that. But like I said, going back to your
Right, or even any species. Like, it doesn't have to be critically endangered. But why do we even need to kill it if we can just take a blood sample to get its DNA? We can take a video of it. We can do a 3D scan.
right, so the big rationale is, and what will still continue to happen for a long time probably is, when you have the specimen in a jar, we don't know all the questions to ask right now. Like we can't be that presumptuous to think that we know everything. We can get all the data we need now and never need any more. So when we have specimens, especially back before we had good cameras or anything else, then that was really the only way to do it. You go out and you collect something, and now we can do research and we can go back to that specimen from 150 years ago and say like, okay, well actually, it turns out it was this, and that means something really important, that it was overlooked by the researcher at the time. And that could still happen 150 years ago or 150 years from now, where some researcher comes in and be like, oh, those people in 2023 didn't know what they were doing and they forgot this thing and this. And so you have to have some kind of good reference point to be able to base the scientific arguments and description, like and what you're trying to claim. So that's really why you have this specimen. And when there's a big population of things, and it's not, because conservation is always worried about populations usually, and sometimes the population is only a single individual, unfortunately, but generally it's not. And so when you take, when you euthanize a series of maybe 6, but there's 20,000 left, that's the percentage of that, it's not really having that huge of an effect, hopefully. So then the argument against doing that becomes a little bit less. So really, the 3D scans, while they are definitely should be, we definitely advise people to do them concurrently with any euthanization. Like even if they're going to pursue euthanization, you can still 3D scan it in real life and gain additional data. But then when you do euthanize it, you can get certain things, like you could dissect, you get internal morphologies. You can look at the retina. You can like do electron scanning on the skin, on dermis, and you can do all kinds of things that you wouldn't be able to do with just a digital specimen. But if we're only interested in describing a species and being able to be like, hey, this really needs adequate conservation attention right away, because or else we're going to lose it, which is a lot, unfortunately, at this place in time. And then there isn't a good argument against using the 3D scans for those critically endangered or even just endangered animals that you need to get access immediately to everybody, and you're worried that the population will take a hit if you take those out of those mature individuals out of the population.
Okay, got it. That makes more sense. So anything else you want to mention about the 3D scanning system? Is it basically like an object that you put in your backpack, and then when you go on these expeditions and you find something, you just put like a frog in this box or this container and it would take a 3D scan?
Yeah, so we worked with like a photogrammetry expert, and he collaborated with us, and we created this thing. And it's essentially like an upside down tripod with this rotating set of Sony cameras that we can then take 300 photos of a ventral and dorsal aspect of the animal, and then combine that all into one cohesive 3D model. The thing is, like the big problem, what I want to emphasize here, is that currently I'm the only one on Earth who can do this, and that's not a brag. That's a problem. Like myself, I can only have so much impact and be in so many places. So what we really are struggling with now is to get people to invest into designing this second version of the 3D scanner, so that it's cheaper, because right now it's running the cost of like $7,500 to be able to create this, and for conservation that's a lot of money. And it's also intensely technical to be able to achieve. So we need to simplify the model, which I already designed this thing. Like the idea is already there, and I think it'll work out. We simply need people to come in and help us, CAD design and get this thing, from idea to product, and so that we can get it out to conservationists, researchers, and citizen scientists around the world that they can actually afford it and use it, and then it will have a big impact. Right now, it's pretty much a proof of concept. We have used it, and we have taken scans out in the jungle, and it has helped us. But we need more people to be able to use it, to be able to have the impact that we really desire out of it. And for that, we need people. We need it's only like 20 grand to be able to design this new tech, which is nothing in the tech world. So it's kind of astonishing to me how people are really not jumping in on this opportunity to have such a huge impact for such a low cost. Like that's what all the Biodiversity Group does is like we literally created this 3D scanner, the first time in the world we can do this 3D scan. And I think the Biodiversity Group spent less than $1,000 on everything because we got it donated from Sony. And then the rest of it I used in like all my photography travel that had all kinds of other gear and rails and stuff that we created it. So it's like we did something, a world first for under $1,000, and now we're trying to, get it out to the entire world for 20,000. And then it's like, why it's such a no brainer to be able to support. So I hope somebody out there is interested in doing that.
Yeah, let me see if I have any connections to relate to you. I know a few folks in like AI, VR, AR, and this technology isn't new. Like we already have this technology.
Yeah,
I've
right.
seen some product videos or trailers where you don't even need multiple cameras. You just use your phone's camera to scan, for example, a room, and it can reconstruct everything very accurately, including the furniture and all the items that are all over the room. I think like Apple and Google can already do this, but I don't know if they released it yet.
It's true, but just the point that you can't do that for the science of it though, because we need stuff to be. You can't just extrapolate. You need it to be within certain degrees of accuracy.
Oh, I see.
So in order for this to be accepted by the scientific community, you have to actually have it valid data and not just guess data.
Right.
It's incredible technology.
All right, so we found a new species. The next step is we need to submit it to the IUCN to assess if it's critically endangered, or if it doesn't even need conservation attention. So can you briefly describe how that process works?
Yeah, so I went over it a little bit, but it's like there's these species specialist groups, of which I'm a member of several of them. So is my director of research, Ross Maynard, who usually handles the assessments for IUCN for us. So we say like Amocleophis fulguri, which is a big name for Fulgur's shadow snake. It was a species that we had rediscovered in Rio Mandurriaca Reserve in Ecuador, and it hadn't been seen in 54 years. It's this really incredible animal, has this really interesting skeletal structure, and we've only ever found 2 of them. And we know that there's a different, a couple other specimens from Colombia, but of probably a different species. So like we gather all the data that we can that's been published and from like any rumors that we have within our network of pertaining to that species. And then we take all that data, we put it through this rubric that IUCN has, International Union for Conservation of Nature, and they're the authority for all this. And then it turns like a kind of a score at the end, and it tells you, okay, well, it falls into this category for this reason, and then that gets authorized by the IUCN, and then it gets posted into the red list or the red book, and then that's official. And that's like a big step because you can't really ask the Ecuadorian government to put in any protections until they have essentially the IUCN approval on that, which is the only conservation organization that sits on the UN. Like, so they have a lot of sway. So that's like one of the big steps.
Right. So the main outcome of this step is to classify how endangered this species is.
Right. And that then tells people it's worthy of their attention.
Got it. So let's say we do find that this new frog that we discovered is endangered. So the next step you mentioned is to ask for funding to protect this area where we found the frog, correct? So can you go into more details on who to ask for funding and how does this all work? How do you allocate these resources?
Right. So, if you have an in-situ program, like an in-place program, and you have the piece of land that you're protecting, and you maybe have some other forest that you want to incorporate into it, you need money to be able to purchase it and to pay the lawyers to be able to get the titles in place and everything else. So you can get that money in various ways. You can apply for grants, you can apply for like corporate CSR funds, or just through general donation campaigns. And your end goal is simply to likely to protect something, but you can do so in a lot of different ways, through its community involvement, through agroforestry, through just ranger, like just protecting an area. So that really depends on the case, like the actual case. It may each vary case by case, is what I'm trying to say. But so the acquiring the funds is part of what the Biodiversity Group helps other organizations do as well. So it's somewhat interesting to some people. I won't go into too long, but when you're an international organization, you're small, say you're in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you're asking people for donations, where do you want to go for donations? or trying to get to grant, asking for grants, and most of those come from the United States. Like we had gone over 450 billion in total philanthropic contributions. So, but you don't speak English, you speak French, and you're also a small organization, and you don't have a lot of money to make yourself look good or do any proper marketing. So, in essence, like when you're somebody like a corporation or a grant committee, and you're looking through it, and you're somebody that's well organized and looks well organized, it has a greater chance of getting funded than somebody who doesn't. And it looks like a ragtag group of people that maybe that you don't have any reliable way to know if they're trustworthy or not. So we go out and vet these organizations. We can then support them. We give them fiscal sponsorships in this novel structure we created, which we called an altruistic fiscal sponsorship, which is a mouthful. But so we give them bank account access in the United States and a nonprofit corporation in the United States, and then they can look really professional, and they deserve to look professional because they are legitimate. And then they can have a much easier time petitioning for funds and to ask for money to be sent domestically from the U.S. to within the U.S. than from going to the U.S. to DRC. And it just gives them the opportunity. Some grants don't even allow foreign organizations to apply because they only want to be able to have that money go in a tax deductible way to somebody within the U.S., an organization within the U.S. So being able to provide these kind of fiscal resources for organizations is huge, because you can't protect something if you don't have any money. And money is always the thing. Like, we just don't have enough of it. It's too hard to get. It's too hard to ask. And so we try to make these things all easier for people. We have a giant grant database, and we help these organizations write grants to be able to actually get the funds. So there's like this comprehensive way of us to being able to go to an area, help the organization decide figure out what's in their protected area, what they need to do to protect it, how to get the money to protect it, and actually have a successful project. And so that's by and large what the biodiversity group does.
Got it. And then moving on to the last stage that you mentioned, there's a constitution regarding the right of nature, right? And it would be unconstitutional if you do some activity that could push a species to extinction. And this constitution is present in a few countries. So does that basically mean, like, if we find an endangered species in a particular area, and if there are activities such as mining or forestry or anything that could potentially push this species to extinction, then legally we have a chance to fight for and protect that area? Is that basically how it works?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a bunch of movements to try to get the rights of nature enshrined in their country constitutions. This is spreading. I think New Zealand's also done it. And so it's a big movement. It's a great movement. We're not necessarily party to that. We're simply benefiting from it being in the Constitution. We work with like a nonprofit lawyer group within Ecuador to be able to uphold the law, and so like to set the precedents, which we, like I said, the big collective we have done with that Los Tedros case, and now moving on to a couple others. So it's another tool in our arsenal to protect things. But again, like, threats come from all fronts, and that's just one front.
Right. Do you have an idea of what's the sentiment towards conservation for these people who are living in these developed countries? Because I would imagine many of them are living in poverty, so they might need to depend on these activities like mining or logging or resource extraction so they can make more money and have a better livelihood for their families. So what's their sentiment towards like conservation and actually protecting their natural resources?
Right. So, you're talking about everybody, but in general, my experience has been, whether it's with indigenous groups or just local communities, they all recognize the importance of nature and the beauty of it, but they don't weigh it more than, and obviously they wouldn't weigh it more than their own livelihoods. And that's always the equation here. So, you go into a community and they don't have jobs and they see themselves as struggling, even though, they're not necessarily struggling for food or anything, but they want a new phone, that kind of thing. They get caught in the modernity cycle. So whatever, they value that more than preserving that forest. So they will continue to cut down plant plantations or sell out to the mining companies so that they can have those things that they think that they need or that they actually do need. And so it's really about, when you talk to adults, because that's where their mind's at. If you initially talk to children, a lot of times they'll actually be scared at first, but then they very quickly pivot to being absolutely fascinated by all of it and wanting to protect it all. So it's a really great route to be able to impact to take the children out and engage them so that the children can then take that message home, and kind of like this bottom up approach where it goes through through us to the children up to the parents, and then they'll believe it more and value it more because their child values it. So it's like there's again different ways of approaching it, but like I said, in general, even if stuff's like you have these indigenous hunter-gatherer groups or subsistence hunters, and they'll know that they're having a harder time hunting, and they don't necessarily know why or what they can do about it. But they're like, yeah, I know we don't have any more pangolin here. Like we don't, we're struggling now. We're having to supplement with this other like crop or something like that. And they don't want that to happen, but nobody's engaging them. They don't have quality education. You can't really blame them for any of this. So it's all a lot of it is education, but education only goes so far, and you need them to be actually able to feel the need to do that. And so that it's like a multi-pronged approach to be able to convince them.
So for our listener who feels passionate about this issue, they want to do something to contribute to giving more conservation attention to species in need. What are some action items that they can start doing today? What would you recommend?
It really so there's a lot of opportunity, especially if you go to Conservation Careers. It's a website, and they help people switch from one career to another, or just find opportunities on the side where if you have professional skill sets, then you can apply them towards various conservation programs. And they can kind of figure out a way for you to fit your skill set in there. We have different things, like if you're, like you said, somebody who's developing AR, or we have AI projects, and we need people to do like all kinds of different marketing, social media campaigns, all kinds of stuff like that. So if you have extra time and you have those skill sets, then please, it doesn't have to be the biodiversity group. You could ask somebody else, try to make sure it's a small organization that you're trying to support, because when you support a small organization versus a large one, your time is much more effective, because you donate $100 to the biodiversity group, it goes straight to a program and actually has a real impact. But if you donate $100 to the WWF, then it goes to, electricity or, office lease costs and stuff like that. So, just per time, per unit money, it makes a lot more sense to help small nonprofits. And you can also just simply share things on social media, trying to combat visual dilution and get people to care about, wildlife. And now there's all this AI wildlife videos coming out, and then like trying to compete against dance videos is really difficult. So it's like just being able to you yourself be putting your attention where it's most beneficial. So if you click on something and like something from a nonprofit and something that's a progressive thing, then the algorithm is going to keep that coming to you. And then every time you do that, it's also going to leak over to the rest of the community so that it gets shown to them more too. So like even that simple act of just curating your feeds, and so is helpful. And then again, like really the biggest thing is money. I hate to say that, like I actually hate money, but it's what we need. And without it, we can't really have an impact. So we're one of the most effective nonprofits literally on earth. 94% goes to all programs, my actual conservation programs. We don't get paid salaries. We're all very dedicated volunteers. This is our lives. I have a successful consulting company on the side, so I don't need the salary from the biodiversity group. So that all means that, I can put all my spare time into developing things that are, might not be financially sustainable, like economically viable. So they're not going to make us money, but they need to happen. And that's this giant gap in the world where, we don't fund things that if they're not economically viable, well, the biodiversity group can do those things because we can take those risks, and we don't need the funds coming back. So that's kind of things to consider when you're looking to support something.
Okay, so you mentioned selecting smaller nonprofits so that each dollar you put in would have a higher impact, it would have a higher ROI. So what's some advice on how we can select a good small nonprofit to donate to? Like, do we look at their balance sheet or income statement or something else?
So any nonprofit within the United States, and it will have a 990 that they submit, and that is publicly available. Generally, you can't get the ones that are the newest, like 1 or 2 years, because the IRS is just really slow. But you can view that, and you can look and see the breakdown. It's a little technical, but you can see, how much went to salaries and kind of how much went to other things. And so you can see like what kind of purposes they had and where they put their money. That is a way to do it. It's a very in-depth way of doing that. probably the most in depth. But then you can also simply speak to them. You can peruse their social media. You can see what kind of things they're doing, but if they're just jumping on trends and switching to time and time again, or if they, if their mission aligns with your heart and you want to support them. In general, luckily with the nonprofit sector, most of us are just very passionate individuals trying to do the best that we can. So of any sector, it's really like you can just throw a dart at the conservation, or especially the conservation sector, and just find a good organization and be happy with it. And like I said, the real distinction for me when I advise people to do this is to get a small nonprofit versus the big one. To put even more perspective, so of that 2% essentially that goes to all other species on Earth that conservation gets, that's the 2% of all philanthropic donations. The top 10 organizations get something like 75% of that 2% of donations. So then the other over like 8,000 organizations then get 25% of that 2%. And so it's we're fighting for crumbs. Like we need people to support these small nonprofits. So like it's hilarious. It's almost comical how bad the situation is that we're trying to prevent the sixth mass extinction, like this biodiversity collapse, and yet we're giving 2% to the world. I'm like, what the fuck are we doing? This is insane.
I just thought of a theoretical question. I don't know if you would have the answer to it, but I heard of a statistic where it's something like 1% of the people in the United States have 99% of the wealth. So there's like a very small group of ultra wealthy billionaires out there, which I know like a lot of them are donating or funding innovation like AI, biotech, etc. But if we can get them to donate more to conservation, to saving these lesser known species, is that enough money? Do you think this would be enough to alleviate a large part of the problem?
Well, I mean, yes, obviously. It comes with its own problems, because then when you distribute that kind of funding, you get these things called beltway bandits, and if you're a big billionaire, like I do have some sympathy for you, where if you try to donate that amount of money, it's really hard to do that effectively. And so you then end up going through these like middle organizations, they're called the Beltway Bandits, where they take a giant chunk off of themselves and then distribute to other people. But then they generally have really poor follow-up, and they just kind of, whoever has the most attractive proposal gets it, but then like they'll just buy shit for themselves. And so there's a lot of problems when you try to distribute big funding. That's why I also recommend doing this to small organizations, because it's like we have a better governmental structure to manage those funds. And so in general, it's people have estimated in the past that we need something north of $100 billion a year to prevent extinctions and the biodiversity collapse. And relatively speaking, that is fucking nothing. It's literally a drop in the bucket, globally speaking. I mean, we're talking about tens of trillions of dollars globally, and you're asking for 100 billion and to save the planet. So it's really not that much to ask. We don't have that right now. We're still gathering the data to figure out how much we do have. It's likely somewhere around maybe a fifth of what we need. So we definitely need to increase the total pool of funding and do so in effective ways. But yeah, it's a huge problem, and really, like, to really emphasize this is the most important time to be a conservationist in history. Like, you literally, anything that we do now, the lineages that we protect now will then exist for an additional tens of thousands of years of human progress. Like, if we don't kill ourselves, like, your kids 10,000 years from now will still be able to benefit from the impact that you had today by saving a species or that ecosystem that will take tens of millions of years to recoup, and it would be totally different anyway. So like, on human timescales, like, it's incredibly important that we save what is already there, because we're not going to get it back in any reasonable amount of time that we would benefit from. So I just make it this, like, the long-termist view. Like, you can spend such a little amount of money now and have such a million X impact in the future by just saving the things now, so we don't have to recreate it or just remember it, and nobody ever gets to enjoy it again. For the next 100 trillion people that exist don't get to enjoy the Amazon. Like, that would be a travesty, but we can stop it now. So that's why it's the most important time on Earth ever to be able to protect these species and habitats.
Right. Another high-level, super theoretical question. I'm trying to pinpoint what are some main areas we can tackle to solve a majority of the problem. So one is money, right? So let's say if we had enough money to buy this plot of land off this mining company, then we can protect it. Simple as that. And then number two is law. So if we can somehow push for a change in the legislature so that it favors conservation, it favors protecting areas that are threatened or endangered or that contain, a large pocket of biodiversity, then we can also protect it. Number three is education. So if we can educate the community to be more passionate about nature, to be more aware of the value of the natural resources that they have, then they would intrinsically not be willing to destroy that area for mining or resource extraction. So like three main things here. One is money, two is law, three is education. Which of those three things, if we can only focus on one, would you think would have the biggest impact at a global scale?
I mean, if I think about it like in a comprehensive way, it would be the education, because with education comes the donations, comes the money. Like if everybody understood what was happening and felt the need to act, then that engagement everything else comes after that. So we first just need to be able to convince people to take the right actions and do the right things. And that's another thing with this 3D scans. I'm sure a lot of your audience has also had an experience where if you went to a zoo or some kind of event where they had animals at the event and you could interact with them, you could touch the snake or you hold the frog or feed the flamingo, whatever it is. That leaves, especially if that's your first one, that leaves a huge impact on you, and it changes, especially children, it changes their whole perspective, and it could change them from having one career choice to another. And I know it did for me. But what we're trying to do with these 3D scans, I can put out all the great social media and I can tell you all the cool facts about this species, and you can tell me, you can come back and be like, no, that's really neat. Like like objectively, like you really had me. That was cool. But I'm not going to they're not going to change anything because they didn't feel anything from it. They only thought conceptually about it. So then when you have these 3D scans, like I didn't have a frog to show them have them hold this epic frog that I'm telling about because there's only two left and they're in the jungle. So with a 3D scan, they can literally, with augmented reality, they can hold it in their hand in the most close to physical way that they possibly could, and then have this personal interaction with them that can then impact how they feel. And then that's how they're going to get behavior change. So be able to do that. And like right now, I can do these presentations. I've done them before. You can go in front of, a classroom or even multiple classrooms and do it and have a great impact. But again, that's me and only, 100 people at a time, maybe if you're lucky. But if I can do this at scale and have like an app that we can just have these animal interactions happen to, tens of millions of people every day, then, there's the impact. You're going to get the education and the engagement that's going to create real behavior change and a real continuous zeitgeist shift in the right direction. And so that's what we're hoping these 3D scans will also contribute to.
That makes sense. Well, you're doing a lot of awesome things, from leading the biodiversity group to creating that 3D scanning software to defeating that mining company in court. So I'm curious, what's your story and how did you get to where you are today?
It was a long journey, man. I'll keep it brief. I wanted to be an entomological systemicist. I wanted to just go and collect bugs in the Amazon until I was in freshman year of college. And when I did that, well, I still do actually, but I went and I thought I had this career path figured out. And then I talked to the entomological curator at the University of Arizona. And then he abruptly told me, like, no, don't take that path. It just broke me. I was like, wait, what? And he's like, no, there's no money in it. You can't really pursue that. It's not reasonable. So then I went in and I fumbled around. I landed in genetics. I started a PhD for 2 years on genetic engineering. And then I dropped out of that as soon as I got an offer to do these consulting jobs, which I continue to do, which is essentially like kind of glorified birding. You go out and you're on these big construction projects and you ensure they're within environmental compliance, which means you protect nests and threatened species. So you're kind of just surveying the whole time and making sure that you know what they're going to do and make sure all the laws are upheld. So that allows me to have a lot of time and some extra cash to be able to do these very privileged things, like wildlife conservation, unfortunately, is a very privileged occupation. And even though I struggle immensely with it. And so in 2013, that was like a year after I quit my PhD, I went to Bangladesh. I heard about this guy, Cesar Rahman, and he was doing work with Burmese pythons out there and he needed some help. And I came out there to be the intercelomic implantation surgery specialist. and because I had seen this done twice, and I was confident I could do it myself. And in fact, I did. It was fine. It was a risky move, but it's a lot of times you just got to fake it till you make it. And we had a very successful project. Never had any deaths with these pythons. We put these transmitters into them and did this huge study, and discovered a lot of things about the government that were when they were relocating these pythons, the effective way to do it to keep the human wildlife conflict at bay, because they would eat the ducks and the villagers would kill them and that kind of thing. So then we realized that the research was, it's important, but it's not the end all be all. And really, wildlife doesn't need to be as managed much as people do. So then you go into the wildlife conservation, which is really managing people a lot. And we created the Creative Conservation Alliance, which is now like one of the most successful conservation organizations in the country. And I since kind of left that officially in 2019. There's a whole bunch of stories I can get into about that. Again, kind of getting kicked out of the country for ridiculous reasons, and it's a whole thing. But so they're still doing great work. The Biodiversity Group still supports them with the fiscal sponsorship and everything, and we're still published together. And we'll be running a workshop there next year, actually, likely in earlier summer. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned to our social media, because we'll resume these really popular workshops, and we take people out and see the pythons or see pangolins and do camera trapping and work with the indigenous, and it's a lot of fun. And I'm also a professional photographer, so I teach people how to do photography. And but yeah, so then in 2018, so like a year before I was leaving the Creative Conservation Alliance, the executive director and the founding executive director of the Biodiversity Group, Paul Hamilton, he was burning out with the organization because it's really hard to do these nonprofits. It takes a lot out of you. I can definitely speak from personal experience with that. And it's really just a challenge, because you see something that's so critically vital, and then, it falls on deaf ears a lot, and people just don't have the right sense of where to put money and where not to. So it's a struggle to do this. I kind of restructured the biodiversity. So he bailed. He didn't want to be part of the biodiversity group anymore. I took it over, and it ended up being a great platform for me to be able to execute all my crazy ideas, like 3D scanning wildlife, or creating. We have this Ask Darwin AI for researchers and public and stuff like that. So I can do all this crazy fun stuff that has really great impact. And that was in 2018 when I started that. And it was a really great transition going out of the Creative Conservation Alliance into the Biodiversity Group. And then here we are now, and I'm still managing it, and still the Biodiversity Group's doing great. We have a lot of great momentum going forward, and it's just about getting the right buy-in from people so that we can have the impact that we know we can. So that's it in a nutshell.
That's a very inspiring story, so thanks for sharing that. And you mentioned a point that really resonates with me, which is that people in conservation are pretty damn poor. It's really hard for them to make money. Like most people, they just end up with like consulting jobs or doing environmental assessments for these mining companies. It pays very little, and they're not really carrying out their noble mission. I doubt this is what people in conservation ultimately would love to do. And like you mentioned, this field of conservation, it's a very privileged thing, and you need to have enough money, yet you need to have enough resources to go on your noble mission. So what advice would you give people in conservation who are stuck doing these boring consulting jobs, but would much rather contribute to, saving species and actually making a difference?
Yeah, so again, it's all going to be case dependent. Like the effective altruism movement, they talk about, well, the biggest impact you can have is or one of the biggest ways you can have a big impact is to generate a lot of money and then just donate it to good causes. And that is a great model. And it kind of got them in trouble a little bit, but anyhow, so you can go that route. Obviously, you need to sustain yourself. If you can't sustain yourself, you can't sustain a passion, and like especially one that is outward and trying to give. So to be a caretaker of the world, you have to care for yourself, and that means you do need to have some money. If you go to there's a lot of things we can talk about here, but I'm moving to Panama soon, and it's a lot cheaper to live there. So the upkeep for my life is less. So that means I can dedicate more time and effort to things that matter to me in the world. And so you can leverage those kind of geographic discrepancies, where if you can make money in the United States, then go, but you live in a different country is way cheaper. That is incredibly helpful. And also it really just nourishes my soul to be living in the jungle. So that's just for me though. If you it's again, like, just look broadly, look and see what other there's not anything really that unique about the conservation sector when you really dig into it. Like, these problems happen everywhere, just to different extents. And so if you can see how other industries have dealt with it, if what makes other professions successful, how are they engaging the public, what does that look like, and compare that to what a non-successful thing is. Like, if you're only putting out dry media and it's really academic sounding and stuff, like, probably not going to be that effective. So figure out what, like, a really popular TikToker does, so that you can get that engagement that is required to do anything nowadays. So there's that. But yeah, it's like I said, just think creatively too. Don't let somebody tell you that it can't happen. It's Be smart about it, but you can take some risks, especially if you're younger, and just keep your horizons broad. And I guess one other thing I'll say to that is, it's something I lived by, was I pretty much said yes to everything and then started saying no to everything once I was turned about 33. So you just keep yourself open to opportunities when you're young, and then and it didn't really ever steer me wrong. Like, I got such a vast array of experiences that contributes to all the decision making I make now. So when you have the time, definitely say yes to random things and just have a good time with it.
Well, there's a lot of gold nuggets there, so thanks for sharing all those insights. From your years of work and experience in this field, if you could distill it down to 3 main lessons or call to actions that you would like to share with our audience, what would that be?
I think the first one is just persistence. When you know that what you're doing and you feel what you're doing is right, a lot of evidence to support that, then just persist. Like, almost any conservationist I see that tries something and continues to try succeeds. So it's really about how much, everything in life is about how much you're willing to sacrifice in order to attain it. So if you're going into conservation, know that you're going to have to sacrifice a lot. Some parts are glamorous, most of it is not. The field work is fantastic. At least for me, it was like, make sure I continue to do field work, because if you only do admin, then you get totally burnt out. So make sure you try to find a balance, which is probably the hardest thing in life. But so that'd be one. 2 would be, like, always continue learning. Don't think that, like, you had a best practice, you read best practices and they were from 2009. Like, best practices should evolve. Like, everything you're learning should evolve. Everything changes, especially now when the rate of change itself is increasing around the world. So just always keep on top of things and look at, like, a broad array of discussions and viewpoints. If you're only within a certain activist community, then you only hear that and you get your echo chamber, and there can be a lot of valid points there. But when no single community is right on everything. So if you listen to other points of view, and I do this a lot, and I listen to, like, tech stuff and from other billionaires and things like that, just to figure out how the world works and what's happening, that puts the biodiversity group at a great position where we can leverage new technologies and not get caught in a pitfall that others have, or I can generate new ideas and take them from one sector and put them into another. So, like, just keeping it learn broadly.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for coming on and sharing your insights. Please hand off to the audience where they can contact you, learn more about your work, or any other resources you would like to share.
Sure. So the biodiversity group is, we have our webpage, we have all the social media, we can just search for it. You can search for my name. It's all out there. Very easy to find. We even have TikTok. It's not super active, but so we do a lot of cool stuff. It is actually worth a follow. We try not to be dry like a lot of other nonprofits are, and try to have some character. And so just follow the website and all the links are there.
That's it for this episode of Ecochat. If you enjoyed this content, please remember to leave a rating and review in whatever podcast platform you listen to. This really helps the show get promoted by the algorithm and get shown to more people. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll meet again next episode.